Thank you. I appreciate you invited me to come give a presentation. As she mentioned, I'm Dave Simeral. I'm from the Desert Research Institute in Reno, Nevada, in the Atmospheric Sciences Division, as well as Western Regional Climate Center, which is one of 6 regional climate centers for NOAA. And I also am one of 11 US Drought Monitor authors. And today I'm going to give you an overview. I've got a lot of slides, so I'll try not to go over time here, and I might go through a couple pretty quickly. But I wanted to give you the basics of the US Drought Monitor. Are all of you familiar with the US Drought Monitor? Anybody not familiar with it? Good. So I'm going to talk about what it is, who makes it and uses it, what data we use in the process of formulating the map, and then I'm going to get into a little more depth on the data analysis and the map creation process. Okay, so trying to get used to all these. I get screens and everywhere I'm looking here. I don't know where to look. So the US Drought Monitor is a composite map of drought that started in 1999, and it's a joint product by the USDA, NOAA, and the USDA, NOAA, and the National Drought Mitigation Center, where Cody is from. It's part of an early drought warning system through NIDIS, which Elizabeth is affiliated with, and you'll hear more about that. And it's also the most widely used gauge of drought in the country. And you see it on the news, and it's kind of all over the place in newspapers. So who creates the weekly map? We have 11 authors for the US Drought Monitor. I'm the only Western author for the Drought Monitor. We've got 2 authors at the National Drought Mitigation Center at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, a couple down at NCEI, that's part of NOAA, a couple at USDA in Washington, D.C., as well as a couple authors at NOAA CPC. And all the authors are climatologists or meteorologists from national centers, government or academia research. And we work, can you hear me? I think I've, oh, it's back. So we work 2 or 3 2-week shifts annually producing the Drought Monitor. And if we did it anymore, I think you'd kind of go crazy. It's quite a bit of work. Okay. We're frozen here. Grab some assist. Oh, now it's going. Sorry about that. It's not doing the same thing on the screen that I'm looking at here, so okay, let's get back to it. So this is the, just to give you a little bit of history of the US Drought Monitor, this is the very first US Drought Monitor map that came out in 1999. It really doesn't look like the current map. They were still trying to figure out some things with how they were doing the categories. You can see it has the D0, the D1. Those are the drought intensity classifications. The map back then had, you can see the A's and the H's. Those were impacts, types of impacts, and A is for agriculture, H for hydrologic. So the map, that was in May. By August, it was presented to the White House at a briefing there, in which they really liked the map and were looking to make that go from an experimental product into an official government product. And that went operational and kind of joked that that was one of the fastest experimental operational products that ever occurred in the government. It took place in 1 week, which is pretty amazing. And you can see the map looks a bit different than it does now. It went through a number of iterations within the first couple of months. And this was by September. It's starting to look a little bit like the current map, although the colors are different, but you can see the drought classifications on those. And then this is by 2003. Originally, the map had been done in CorelDRAW, which was just a basic software in which you're using colors, coloring things in. This is when, 2003, it went to GIS. And it looks more similar to as it does now, but it still has drought impacts being depicted. And then by 2012, this was I've been an author for 6 years. This was my first map assessment or national assessment of the drought. And this was, the other authors laugh at me because this was kind of initiation by fire. There was a lot of drought in the country, and it was an interesting time to get thrown into it. But as you can see, the Drought Monitor, we do the drought assessment for the lower 48, Alaska, Hawaii, Puerto Rico, and we're going to be starting up the U.S. Virgin Islands, and I'll go into more detail about that. And then this is the current map, and as Candace mentioned at the beginning, Utah and Desert Southwest is kind of the focal point of drought in the country right now. So who uses the USDM? The Drought Monitor is used for drought declarations. The big one that's used for is by FSA for the Livestock Forage Program. And that, basically, we're not influenced at the USDM. We're not changing the map, and that's not part of our analysis, is what's going on as far as we get a lot of folks who will email us and say, you know, it's really dry here, we need to be in this category. So we've been getting a lot of lobbying by ranchers and farmers because the USDM map is the official eligibility for the FSA program. And currently, the U.S. Drought Monitor is the eligibility for payments through the FSA program. And I think that's up to about $7 billion since 2012. It's also used by the IRS and National Weather Service through their drought information statements, as well as a whole variety of state, local, tribal, basin level decision makers as a trigger for drought, and also the media and the general public as well. Overall, our concept in making the map, it's a consolidation of indices and indicators that are put into one comprehensive map. We try to capture the drought's magnitude, which is the duration of the drought, plus the intensity, the spatial extent, as well as the probability of occurrence and impacts. And we rate the drought by percentile rankings. And most of you probably are familiar with the Fujita scale, which is used for tornadoes. And so we have our own classification system that has a similar type of scale. You can see that below the Fujita scale. That's our classification scale. I'll go into a little bit more. And the map is an assessment of the current conditions. It's not a forecast. It's a depiction of what's going on right now. We try to identify drought impacts, and those are, you can see on the map, and I'll show you in a minute, you'll see S's and L's on there, and S is for short term, so that'll be impacts that are occurring less than 6 months, And the long-term ones are more than 6 months, or which are generally things like hydrologic related impacts. The shorter-term ones are generally things like agriculture. We also tried to, one of our key things that's really important is the integration of our local experts into the process. And this is one of the things that I'm going to try and drive home here today, is to get, we'd like to get more impact information and input from the state of Utah. We have very little input from the state currently, and we've been having discussions about this for a while, and I think it would serve to have a more accurate depiction of drought within the state if we could get some more impacts information from around the state. So hopefully out of this, we'll have some more folks that are participating in the process. We try to be objective as possible in the assessment, although some of it is subjective by the author, and some of the impacts information is quite subjective. But the percentile process, looking at percentiles, and I'll show you as we move on how that works. And then we use a convergence of evidence approach. So we don't look at just one or two indicators. We look at a whole variety of different indicators to make our decisions as to what the severity of the drought is. So if you haven't seen this, this is our drought classification scale. We use key indicators like PDSI, the Palmer Drought Severity Index, soil moisture, stream flows, standardized precipitation indices, objective blends, and dozens of other parameters. We look at a number of these different parameters in different time scales as well, from what happened in the last week all the way back to sometimes 4 or 5 years. We look at drought impacts. We consider local reports as well. And as I mentioned, we use the percentile rankings. And as you can see here, we use, these are the percentile rankings for each of the different categories, the parameters we're looking at. And they're associated with the different intensities of drought. The warmer colors are more intense, the lighter colors. D0 is not drought, it's abnormally dry conditions. So what this allows us to do in having percentile rankings, many of our data products and the people we work with who create the various data products that we use in the assessments, we have basically using the percentiles, we're able to have the same color coding and percentile rankings across the different products. So it makes it easy for us to be able to look at different parameters and to be able to have kind of a uniform system in which we can look at the percentile rankings. These are just examples of a couple different parameters that we use, which I'll go into some more. So what really makes the Drought Monitor work is our larger group of contributors across the country. Currently, we have over 400 contributors that are participating in the process. We have a listserv, which is and if anybody here is interested in getting on that list, but be prepared to be getting hundreds of emails a week. It's a bit overwhelming. But if you'd like to be involved in this, and it's basically a continuous conversation that goes on 7 days a week, 365 days a year. And some people are a little nervous giving input because it goes out to 400 plus people, and there's often heated discussions go on, but people are very respectful. But this is where a lot of the information that we get in terms of state level conditions and the input in regards to impacts occurs through the listserv. And this is our breakdown of where our contributors are and the number of them. And you can see Utah, we've got 3 at the moment, and we would like to increase that number. Our input currently from Utah on the map generally is coming from the Upper Colorado River Basin group out of Colorado, and they do an assessment for about half of the state of Utah, the eastern half. The western state, we essentially have no input from. So that's an area that we would like to know more about what's going on, because I know there's not a huge population base in the western part of the state, but there's a lot of BLM land and grazing and some agriculture in some of the smaller communities in the western part of the state. So we'd like to improve the communications and know more about what's going on in those areas. And our contributors, they provide our ground truth to the data. So our regional and local input, we get a lot of input from the state climatologists from around the country, regional climate centers where I work at the Western Regional Climate Center. There's 5 other regional climate centers as well. We get input from the regional climate service directors, a lot of input from the National Weather Service Forecast Office, the River Forecast Centers for the Weather Service as well, Drought State Task Force. There's input that gets distributed out through a lot of the NIDIS webinars that, like Elizabeth and some of the other NIDIS Drought Early Warning System regions hold webinars on, 2 or 3, maybe about 3 times a year, maybe a little bit more. And we talk about the current conditions and so forth during that. So it's a good opportunity to talk about conditions during that. As well as you can see there's the various DEWs in the west, and those are the drought early warning systems that were put together by NOAA. And you see those are the western ones. We also have an opportunity to get input and get people familiarized through the process that the Drought Monitor goes through each week at the USDM and the National and the North American Drought Monitor forums. And those are on alternating years. So every 2 years, the US Drought Monitor has a national forum, and we invite folks from the listserv to, as well as Drought Monitor authors and people who create the products that we use to do the assessments. And these are past a listing of those forums. And on alternate years, the North American Drought Monitor, which is the other product that's made, which obviously links in the US Drought Monitor with what's going on in Mexico and up in Canada as well. The next Drought Monitor forum will be in Kentucky in the spring. So kind of getting into some of the nuts and bolts of how the Drought Monitor works each week. So basically, as I mentioned, you've got a different Drought Monitor author about every 2 weeks. We communicate with each other. We have our own listserv in which we talk amongst ourselves, sometimes vent amongst each other. But we have a transition that goes on between the current author and the next one. So we basically debrief each other on when I finish a shift, I'll do a big write-up, and that'll be handed on to the next author so that we have continuity between the authors and know what's going on and any issues that need to be addressed in the current map. So basically, Thursday, Friday, over the weekend, we're kind of ramping up. We're getting all the drought shape files, the current ones, from the National Drought Mitigation Center, which does all the processing of the map. They keep the website up. And so I'll get the GIS files for those, load those into my ArcMap system. I'll start looking at the 5-day QPF, the quantitative precipitation forecast, to see what it's looking like for the week ahead. By Monday, I'll have the first draft that goes out, various coordination calls. I'll be on. Different state drought coordination teams have weekly calls, and they'll have anywhere from 10 to 30 people on a call that are talking about the current conditions. And by the end of that call, they'll make a recommendation that's passed on to the U.S. Drought Monitor author. And then I'll go through and verify that, as well as other input and recommendations from other states that I'm receiving, and I'm verifying the data. I don't just take a recommendation that's given. Ultimately, it's up to the author to make the decision whether to make changes in the state. By Tuesday, more emails, and this is literally on the scale of like hundreds of emails that we're going through within the course of a couple days, more conference calls and so forth. And then by Wednesday, we're putting out our final draft and putting together a narrative, and I'll go into that some more. And then the files get sent to National Drought Mitigation Center. They run some statistics on it and look at changes in the amount of drought on the map and so forth. And then Thursday, the final map goes out. Looking at some of the data that we use mainly quantitative data, but we have some qualitative data as well. Meteorological and climate data, soil moisture, the hydro data. We're looking at stream flow, groundwater to a lesser extent, because groundwater isn't always impacted by drought. It can be over a longer term, but in places like the Central Valley, where groundwater is completely depleted, almost in certain areas, we would have a permanent D4 over an area. So groundwater isn't weighed as heavily in the process. But in the West, reservoir levels are very important. Objective blend indicators, I'm going to get into that tomorrow. I'm giving a talk more on some of the, getting more in depth on the data products that we use. Vegetative health and stress, those are generally remote sensing based products that looking at greenness and the vegetative health of the plants. Fire danger impacts, evaporative stress indices. And then on the qualitative end, we're looking at crop progress and conditions reports. Those are put out by NASS, the USDA, agricultural reports, impact reports, and you can see on the bottom left that picture, that's from the National Drought Mitigation Center. That's our impact reporter, and we like to look at reports that are coming in through there. So overall, our approach to doing the analysis is a convergence of evidence approach. So we're not using a single indicator or a couple indicators to determine the intensity of the drought. We're using a whole variety of different indicators. This is just kind of a sample of a variety of different indicators that we use. If you're part of the listserv, these are our weekly maps that come out, and we distribute them to the people on the listserv, and it has probably over 100 different indicators. And so for your state's purposes, you may want to take a look at some of this data. A lot of this data is available in various places from different government agencies, but we've consolidated it. And so this is a really good resource as well. In terms of our local input, a lot of folks who get, when a state comes in and they get part of the U.S. Drought Monitor process, they don't know how to deliver the input to us. And it comes in a variety of different forms. I have this picture of, you ever seen the movie A Christmas Story? This is Ralphie with his secret decoder ring. So that's kind of how I feel. I'm trying to like put together, like looking at some of the input that comes in. It's pretty confusing. Like you'll get this email is, I've cut this off, but it goes on for much longer. And there's this long dialogue of naming all these counties and all these places, and you're just looking through it going, you know, some states like Texas has like hundreds of counties, and trying to figure out where all this stuff is. So as authors, we like maps. Maps work really well to give us a better idea of where things are. And this is an example of input that's coming in from the Upper Colorado group, the Upper Colorado River Basin, which does, like I said, the eastern half of your state. So it has the current depiction, their recommendations, and then they'll have a narrative that goes along with it. That's really helpful for us. But other things that are really nice that we get from people, like these came in just over the past week. These are from some photos that came in of some drought impacts. Those are from Virginia, and just showing possibility of some flash drought that's occurring there, where you've got some dryness that's gone on over the last like 30 days, which has been impacting the corn. This other photo here, this is from Missouri, some low stock ponds. So we're open to, we like getting photos with locations. That helps us out a lot. And then there's Texas. It's like every week the author, this is this kind of joke amongst us, that when the Texas recommendation comes in, it's just like, oh no. And this is literally like what we'll get almost every week. Not only is it confusing to read, but to try and interpret that and make the changes in GIS. So that's kind of what it looks like to us on the other side. Just another example. This just came in like a day ago. This is from Missouri, some flash drought. But I think in terms of Utah, I think some things that I think that we're missing, like in the western part of the state or other parts of the state, we get information from the crop progress reports from NASS, but they seem to, you know, 1 month we'll get some detail on it, and then next month there's like nothing. I'd like to know more from like at the state level or BLM field offices, like coming into springtime, late spring, in terms of grazing allotments, like the conditions, like in a, you know, we're in a drought right now in Utah. We'd like to know if allotments are getting closed off or that type of thing. It would be really important. And I've got like 8 minutes, so I'm gonna whiz through these. The data analysis process, as I mentioned, is done in GIS and ArcMap. We're fortunate to have most of the data layers available to us, that we can pull them in. So basically, we've pulled in the drought layers here. As you can see, that's kind of the first thing we do. And this is just my approach to doing it. The other 10 authors, we kind of have our own way of going about doing the assessments. They're all kind of similar, but this is mine. This is kind of my first step. I've pulled in the 7-day observed precip from the US. So this is taking a look at that. And what I've done here is I've made the drought layers transparent so I can see through to the other layer, which you can see all the different colors on there. So that's basically the 7-day precipitation. Here's a scale of how much rainfall has fallen. So I look at this as like areas of interest to me this is like my starting point. So I'll say, okay, well, these are some areas where we've got intense drought. We've had some heavy precipitation in these particular areas. So that will be kind of my focal point to start out. Then I may do something like this is, what I just showed you here is from the AHAPS, which is the Advanced Hydrologic Prediction Service from the National Weather Service. So this is a combination of radar data, observational data, And in areas where the radar, there isn't coverage, there's satellite precipitation estimates that are put into it. So what I've done here is I overlay, and for the western US, we don't have that great a radar coverage, so I can't really trust it in certain areas. So I've overlaid where we have beam blockage here, by the radar beam is blocked by the mountains. So in these areas, I'm going to look more closely at some of these areas, whether these are real returns or not. The data could be not good in those particular areas. This is where GIS is really helpful. And next step is kind of zooming in to the particular area. I've zoomed into Utah here so you can take a look. And this was I did this a couple days ago. This was the 7-day precip. And what I can do at this point is turn on other layers, roads, cities, and so forth to give me a better idea spatially where things are occurring. I've also turned on like a shaded relief map. I'm adding other layers here. I think I have, this is a standardized precipitation index. So what I can do is take a look at how the current rainfall event has impacted the SPI. This is a precipitation indice, and see how it's impacted it in terms of various timescales. So I'll turn on 30-day, 60-day, 90-day, and I'll go through and look at all the different timescales. And then I'll turn on other parameters. These are stream flows. And you can see we've got them color-coded for the percentiles. The red ones are areas where stream flows are very low. And the blue are where they're, green is normal, blue is where they're above average. Stream flows, you have to keep in mind, many of these are highly regulated. So we can't just look at a low stream flow and say it's drought. There may be water that's being allotted and partitioned out. And then these are impacts from the COCO-ROS network. It's a volunteer network of precip gauges around the US. And these are impacts that are being reported. And this is another parameter. This is Vegetative Health indice. We can take a look at kind of greenness and where things are dried out. This helps us with short-term and looking at rangeland conditions. And then the actual editing of the layer itself. So this is a D2 layer, and I may, end up moving it slightly over to cover this area where we've got some low stream flows in that particular area. So basically over the years, advances not only in the GIS technology, but the availability of the data sets in gridded formats has really improved the precision and accuracy of the drought monitor. And you can see this is a 2003 map, and you can see it just kind of, it doesn't have the level of detail that we have currently on the map. You also have to take this with a grain of salt because you have to know the data products that you're using. You may get a gridded data set that has really fine resolution, but whether or not that data set is giving you actual real data that's accurate is another question, especially with precipitation data, which precipitation data, to turn it from, say for example, you have an observation point here and you have another one 100 miles away, like in western Utah. There's a lot of interpolation that goes on between those 2 points. So you have to take into consideration how accurate that data is. It may be fine resolution, but it may not necessarily be accurate, so you have to kind of know more about the data set. And then kind of the final steps in our process is on Wednesday, after the final draft goes out, we've got, this is probably the hardest part in my opinion to wrap up the map, is writing up the narrative for it. So basically writing up the weather that's gone on, the highlights of it in the past week, and then all the changes you've made on the map and justification for it. And then it finishes up with looking ahead at, we'll look at the, this is a quantitative precipitation forecast for 7 days ahead, as well as the 8 to 10 day outlooks from CPC. And then that gets sent off to an editor, comes back. This all happens within like the course of an hour. And we have to package up all the shape files, send them off to the National Drought Mitigation Center. They process them, hopefully send us an email saying it's okay. Sometimes it doesn't, and then you panic. And then the map comes out Thursday morning at 8 in the morning Eastern time. And I'll get into more of some of the products that are available through the US Drought Monitor webpage tomorrow. And that's about it.